What makes the people of Israel a unique and set-apart people? What makes the people of God different from the rest of the world? I believe the answer lies with the Torah, God's revelation of righteousness. Observance of the Torah, particularly the sign commandments therein, is what gives Israel identity. Without the Torah, the people of Israel would cease being unique and would just be one of many nations. God gave the people of Israel certain commandments that act as signposts, so to speak, which mark the people of Israel out as God's holy and chosen people. These include, but are not limited to, circumcision, Sabbath keeping, and the kosher laws. Without the observance of these commandments and those like them, there would be no distinct outward qualities to make the people of Israel different from other nations. With that said, what's the greatest threat to the people of God? Military threats? Economic crises? No. Beyond outright annihilation, it is assimilation. It's when the people of Israel no longer observe the specific commandments that make her unique. In the days of the Greek occupation of the land of Israel, it says in 1 Maccabees, "At that time there appeared in the land of Israel a group of traitorous Jews who had no regard for the Torah and who had a bad influence on many of our people. They said, 'Let's come to terms with the Gentiles, for our refusal to associate with them has brought us nothing but trouble.' This proposal appealed to many people, and some of them became so enthusiastic about it that they went to the king and received from him permission to follow Gentile customs. They built in Jerusalem a stadium like those in the Greek cities. They had surgery performed to hide their circumcision, abandoned the Holy Covenant, started associating with Gentiles, and did all sorts of other evil things." 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 11 to 15. The temple was overtaken and desecrated, as it says. Antiochus now issued a decree that all nations in his empire should abandon their own customs and become one people. All the Gentiles and even many of the Israelites submitted to this decree. They adopted the official pagan religion, offered sacrifices to idols, and no longer observed the Sabbath. The king also sent messengers with a decree to Jerusalem and all the towns of Judea, ordering the people to follow customs that were foreign to the country. He ordered them not to offer burnt offerings, grain offerings, or wine offerings in the temple, and commanded them to treat Sabbaths and festivals as ordinary workdays. They were even ordered to defile the temple and the holy things in it. They were commanded to build pagan altars, temples, and shrines, and to sacrifice pigs and other unclean animals there. They were forbidden to circumcise their sons, and were required to make themselves ritually unclean in every way they could, so that they would forget the Torah which the Lord had given through Moses, and would disobey all its commands. The penalty for disobeying the king's decree was death. 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 41 to 50. Some gave in, as it says. Many of the Jews were ready to forsake the Torah and to obey these officials. They defiled the land with their evil, and their conduct forced all true Israelites to hide wherever they could. 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 52 to 53. But some stayed true to the Torah, as it says. Any books of the Torah which were found were torn up and burned, and anyone who was caught with a copy of the sacred books or who obeyed the Torah was put to death by order of the king. 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 56 to 57. Mothers who had allowed their babies to be circumcised were put to death in accordance with the king's decrees. Their babies were hung around their necks, and their families and those who had circumcised them were put to death. But many people in Israel firmly resisted the king's decrees and refused to eat food that was ritually unclean. They preferred to die rather than break the Holy Covenant and eat unclean food, and many did die. 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 60 to 64. But hope came through the family of Mattatyahu. During that time, a priest of the Jehoiarib family named Mattatyahu, who was the son of Yochanan and the grandson of Shimon, moved from Jerusalem and settled in Moadin. Mattatyahu had 5 sons, John, Shimon, Yehuda, Eleazar, and Jonathan. 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verses 1 to 5. In their grief, Mattatyahu and his sons tore their clothes, put on sackcloth, and continued in deep mourning. 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 14. When commanded to make a sacrifice to an idol, Mattatyahu said, "I don't care if every Gentile in this empire had obeyed the king and yielded to the command to abandon the religion of his ancestors. My children, my relatives, and I will continue to keep the covenant that God made with our ancestors. With God's help, we will never abandon his Torah or disobey his commands. We will not obey the king's decree, and we will not change our way of worship in the least." Then Mattatyahu went through the town shouting, "Everyone who is faithful to God's covenant and obeys his Torah, follow me." With this, he and his sons fled to the mountains, leaving behind all they owned. At that time also many of the Israelites who were seeking to be right with God through obedience to the Torah went out to live in the wilderness, taking their children, their wives, and their livestock with them, because of the terrible oppression they were suffering. 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verses 19 to 30. Then Mattatyahu and his friends were joined by a group of devout and patriotic Jews, the strongest and bravest men in Israel, who had all volunteered to defend the Torah. Mattatyahu and his friends went everywhere, tearing down pagan altars and circumcising by force every uncircumcised boy they found within the borders of Israel. They were also successful in hunting down the arrogant Gentile officials. They rescued the Torah of Moses from the Gentiles and their kings, and broke the power of the wicked king Antiochus. 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verses 42 to 48. After Mattatyahu died, Yehuda Maccabee took the place of his father Mattatyahu. All his brothers and all the loyal followers of his father gave him their support, and they were happy to carry on Israel's war. 1 Maccabees chapter 3, verses 1 to 2. One time, just before a battle, when Yehuda's men saw the army coming against them, they asked, "How can our little group of men fight an army as big as that? Besides, we have not eaten all day and we are tired." "It is not difficult," Yehuda answered, "for a small group to overpower a large one. It makes no difference to the Lord whether we are rescued by many people or by just a few. Victory in battle does not depend on who has the largest army. It is the Lord's power that determines the outcome. Our enemies are coming against us with great violence, intending to plunder our possessions and kill our wives and children. But we are fighting for our lives and for our religion. When we attack, the Lord will crush our enemies, so don't be afraid of them." 1 Maccabees chapter 3, verses 17 to 22. Yehuda and his brothers saw that their situation was getting more and more difficult, with foreign armies camped within their own borders. They also learned that the king had commanded the complete destruction of the people. So they determined to rebuild their ruined nation and fight for their country and the temple. Then the whole community came together to prepare for war and to pray for God's mercy. 1 Maccabees chapter 3, verses 42 to 44. Seeing the desolate state of the temple, in deep mourning they fasted all that day, put on sackcloth, threw ashes on their heads, and tore their clothes. The Gentiles would have consulted their idols in such a situation, but the Israelites unrolled the book of the Torah to search for God's guidance. They brought the priest's robes, the offerings of the first grain, and the tithes, and then they brought in some Nazirites who had completed their vows. The whole community prayed, "Lord, what shall we do with these things? Where shall we take them, now that your holy temple has been trampled and profaned by Gentiles, and your priests mourn in disgrace? The Gentiles have come to attack and destroy us. You know what they plan to do. If you don't help us, how can we stand up against them?" 1 Maccabees chapter 3, verses 47 to 53. Finally, the army marched out and took up positions south of Emmaus, where Yehuda said to them, "Prepare yourselves for battle and be courageous. Be ready early tomorrow morning to fight these Gentiles who have joined forces to attack us and destroy us and our temple. It is better for us to die fighting than to stand idly by and watch the destruction of our nation and our temple, but the Lord will do what he pleases." 1 Maccabees chapter 3, verses 57 to 60. At dawn, Yehuda appeared in the plain with 3,000 men, not all of them as well armed as they would have liked. They saw the huge Gentile army of experienced troops wearing armor and protected by cavalry, but Yehuda said to his men, Don't worry about the size of their army, and don't be frightened when they attack. Remember how our ancestors were saved at the Red Sea when the king of Egypt was pursuing them with his army. Now let us ask the Lord to have mercy on us. Let us pray that he will honor his covenant with our ancestors and crush this army when we attack today. Then all the Gentiles will know that Israel has a God who rescues and saves them. 1 Maccabees chapter 4, verses 6 to 11. Once all the armies were defeated, Yehuda and his brothers said, "Now that our enemies have been defeated, let's go to Jerusalem to purify the temple and rededicate it." So the whole army was assembled and went up to Mount Zion. There they found the temple abandoned, the altar profaned, the gates burned down, the courtyards grown up in a forest of weeds, and the priests' rooms torn down. In their sorrow they tore their clothes, cried loudly, and threw ashes on their heads, and fell face down on the ground. When the signal was given on the trumpets, everyone cried out to the Lord. Then Yehuda ordered some of his soldiers to attack the men in the fort, while he purified the temple. He chose some priests who were qualified and who were devoted to the Torah. They purified the temple and took the stones that had been defiled and put them in an unclean place. They discussed what should be done with the altar of burnt offerings, which had been desecrated by the Gentiles, and decided to tear it down, so that it would not stand there as a monument to their shame. So they tore down the altar and put the stones in a suitable place on the temple hill, where they were to be kept until a prophet should appear and decide what to do with them. Then they took uncut stones, as the Torah of Moses required, and built a new altar like the old one. They repaired the temple inside and out, and dedicated its courtyards. They made new utensils for worship and brought the lampstand, the altar of incense, and the table for the bread into the temple. They burned incense on the altar and lit the lamps on the lampstand, and there was light in the temple. They placed the loaves of bread on the table, hung the curtains, and completed all the work. The 25th day of the 9th month, the month of Kislev, in the year 148, was the anniversary of the day the Gentiles had desecrated the altar. On that day a sacrifice was offered on the new altar in accordance with the Torah of Moses. The new altar was dedicated, and hymns were sung to the accompaniment of harps, lutes, and cymbals. All the people bowed down with their faces to the ground and worshipped and praised the Lord for giving them victory. For 8 days they celebrated the rededication of the altar. With great joy they brought burnt offerings and offered fellowship offerings and thank offerings. They decorated the front of the temple with gold crowns and shields, rebuilt the gates and the priests' rooms, and put doors on them. Now that the Jews had removed the shame which the Gentiles had brought, they held a great celebration. Then Yehuda, his brothers, and the entire community of Israel decreed that the rededication of the altar should be celebrated with a festival of joy and gladness at the same time each year, beginning on the 25th of the month of Kislev and lasting for 8 days. 1 Maccabees chapter 4, verses 36 to 59. Unfortunately, the spirit of Antiochus was not totally eradicated, and in fact is still among us today. There are forces at work today that want us to believe that the Jewish people are no longer God's covenant people, and that devotion to the Torah is to be abandoned for the sake of a new and better way. It is not uncommon for Jewish people to come to faith in the Messiah and then be encouraged by Gentile believers to abandon observance of the Sabbath and the other commandments God specifically gave to Israel. Those who advocate this position, that Jewish people should give up their observance of the Torah, are not doing so out of malice, but nevertheless, they are unwittingly succumbing to the spirit that was behind Antiochus. And this spirit is none other than the spirit of Antichrist. Drawing upon the events that took place during the days of the Maccabees, the Apostle Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, "Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God." 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 to 4. The mention of the apostasy and the man of lawlessness is supposed to cause us to remember the events of the Hanukkah Revolution, when many of God's people abandoned the Torah as a result of Antiochus' sanctions. The apostles recognized that at the end of the age there would be a similar trend among God's people to ignore and break God's commandments. It is common for Christians to think that some of God's commandments are done away with. The carelessness that accompanies such a position, since it essentially admits that parts of the Bible are not valid, has led to a whole generation of Christians who have a low moral standard and rarely differ with the world on key issues. As a result, those who call for a reevaluation of our theological thinking are usually met with hostility. To this, Jesus said, because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow old. Matthew chapter 24, verse 12. Since the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 7, we should do all that we can through God's strength to fight against such forces. How can we do that? Well, firstly, we can entirely and truly devote ourselves to the one who kept God's commandments, the one who will slay the lawless one at his coming. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 8 to 9. Our Master, Jesus, led a completely righteous life and taught that not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the Torah. Matthew chapter 5, verse 18. In fact, whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Matthew chapter 5, verse 19. As those who claim to be concerned with what Jesus would do, exemplified in that phrase, what would Jesus do, perhaps it is time that we pay close attention to his teachings and the way he lived his life, and then imitate that with the help of God's Spirit. So what are some practical ways we can be like the Maccabees? Well, number one, we can recognize that there is only one God and that Jesus is God's fully Torah-observant Messiah. Number two, we can recognize the people of Israel as the only true legitimate people of God, and Gentile believers come alongside of Israel but do not replace Israel. Number three, we can recognize the Torah as God's gift to his people. Number four, we can begin to honor the Sabbath and the festivals. Number five, we can begin to learn Hebrew, the language of the Jewish people and of the Bible. Number six, we can begin to keep kosher. In fact, one of the first things the apostles instructed the new Gentile believers to do was to eat meat that had not been strangled or had blood in it, which was essentially a mandate to eat only kosher slaughtered meat. Number seven, we can begin to pray the Shema every day. Jesus himself said that the Shema is the greatest of all commandments, so it would make sense that we join with the Jewish people in reciting at least Deuteronomy chapter 6 verses 4 to 9 every day. And lastly, we can begin to support Jewish tradition and customs. If all Gentile followers of Jesus would simply recognize, as Paul said, the mystery of the gospel is that the Gentiles are heirs together with Israel, at the very least, we could support the Jewish people's right to obey the Torah and do so according to their traditions. The more we Gentile believers know and appreciate the Jewish people and the Torah, the less likely it is that there will ever be a time when the Jewish people have to endure what the people of Israel endured in the days of the Maccabees.